Welcome to the webinar, Advancing Clean Energy in Oregon. I'm Heather Britton and I direct the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center at the University of Oregon. I will helping us move between the speakers this morning. And first, a welcome from Patrick Phillips, the Provost of the University of Oregon.
Good morning, everyone. I see that participants are like storming in here, so I'm just going to wait 30 seconds to get some sort of equilibrium. Okay, seems like we're doing pretty well now. Good. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today at this webinar, Advancing Clean Energy in Oregon. And I want to begin by thanking all of you for participating, but I also want to especially thank and welcome Senator Jeff Golden, Senator Michael Dembrow, and Representative Corinne Power. And I really want to thank them for their engagement and work on today's event. And I think it's a great symbol of what we are as a state, because I think we're all deeply interested in these topics. I want to also acknowledge that this is a challenging format to be, because mostly, I think if we were all together, we would have what I call the power of being present, that we would look around the room and we would see this is a group of dedicated, passionate people who really care deeply about this. And you can't quite get that energy through Zoom. So I do encourage you to take a moment as we go through this day and look around and see that you are one of many who are deeply engaged in these topics and really want to make a difference here. And I think as as concrete borders are going up around the state capitol and we figure out our vaccination planning efforts, we always recognize the problem of the moment. But today, as we take a moment to look at something different, we are really recognizing the need to focus on the problem of our time. And with that in mind, this webinar is really the first public project of the University of Oregon's new environmental initiative. And the initiative is a Provost initiative that I started almost a year ago, and it's led by Adele Amos, who you'll hear from. And the intent of that is a campus-wide effort to bring together every school and college to collaborate on advanced research regarding the environment, and to also then to provide education and training for the next generation of student innovators who will lead these efforts that we're talking about today. So today we have teachers and researchers from the law school, the business school, the College of Design, both the schools of architecture and public planning and management, as well as from the Division of Natural Sciences in the College of Arts and Science. So we're well represented as an institution, and of course we have speakers from many other areas. This is an integrated effort. And as we look towards the future of this initiative, we anticipate that there's going to be an emerging research and teaching node, specifically in the energy future and decarbonization. So this topic is right in line with our university priorities. And I want to highlight the fact that this is, we have a very long-term commitment to the university. We already have invested actually in many dozens of faculty lines that work in the environment. And we're also bringing substantial philanthropic support and plan on generating even more as we move forward. So it's a great opportunity to really make a difference. We're also, and one of our strengths is that we're very committed to inclusion and equity and to amplify the voices in the conversation, especially with regards to social environmental justice as a core activity of all that we do. And that is actually, we have national strengths in that area at the university. But in the end, we really want to make sure the work we do is policy relevant, it's responsive to the needs of the state, the ecoregion, and the country as a whole. We obviously, I think as we do world-class research, it has implications locally. And I think that's the best of all possible worlds for a research university, and one of the great values of having a major research university within the state of Oregon. So today, the legislature is rightly focused on the state's energy future, and we're very grateful that they're actually focusing their attention on that. It seems like a week doesn't go by where there isn't some significant development in clean energy. We have technology breakthrough, market developments, different perspectives on how the market should be used, international pledges, made, broken, made again. So as the legislature begins to think about what to do for our state and what this means for our state, we know that we can actually be part of a regional conversation, but the work that we do here can have national implications, especially as we become exemplars for the rest of the country, which I think we do have the opportunity for that. So through the environmental initiative, we're really proud to be convening this conversation. What the university hopes to say to Salem in particular is that, our state is well prepared to have this conversation. The University of Oregon has expertise and is ready to apply that expertise to the challenges ahead. We want to be a partner in this work because we really want to be at service to the state that we all cherish. That's why we're here. So we hope that as we begin this conversation, we'll create the seeds for relationships and partnership that will grow over time. The legislators will know that when it comes to a broad swath of questions and opportunities, that this discussion will surface, that we're here at your service. We recognize that we don't have all of the answers, and part of our role is to help further the conversation. But we do have, as we will all see, a huge amount of expertise here that can be applied to the problem. So as we get started, I just want to preemptively thank many people who brought this together, especially Greg Dotson at the University of Oregon, the legislative assistants who I know working behind the scenes in coordination, and of course the staff of the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Center who did the hard work of coordinating this activity, drawing it together. So I know it's going to be a huge success for their efforts. So with that, I will thank you again for all being with us at today's event. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And I expect that that will begin today, but it will deepen over the coming days, weeks, and months. And it's a great start to a very important topic. So I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Provost Phillips. We'll now hear from Senator Jeff Golden. Senator, can you unmic or unmute, please?
One would think after 4 or 5 months, you'd master that mute button, wouldn't you? Heather, thank you. And Provost Phillips, thank you. I think you've launched this perfectly. And first, I want to thank you for the university's provision of the team that helped put this together. I don't know all of them. I know several people did, but especially Greg Dotson and Heather Brinton, who really worked hard and well on this. And before I forget, 2 people from the legislative staff who've done the same and made this possible today, Beth Petrino and Laura Kentness. Thank you all. And thanks to the folks who worked, who I didn't mention, for making this happen today. My name is Jeff Golden. I represent District 3 in the state Senate. That is the Medford, Ashland, Phoenix, Talent, Jacksonville, Applegate area in Southern Oregon. And as you might recognize, a couple of those town names as ones that were devastated by wildfire this September. So that's how climate change and climate chaos is affecting my particular district. I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to participate in this event, which I would take to be a great example of the potential of really practical, effective, productive collaboration between the higher education, the university sector and state government. It's, I think all of us who've been involved with or observed public policy know that good public policy depends on good information and some common understanding of the basics, the factual basics of the issues we're dealing with. That might sound a little 1990s, a little antiquated, but we have to keep striving for that. We have to keep striving to anchor our public policy in good, sound information that is widely understood and widely shared. And that, to me, is the value of an event like this. And I'd like to know more. Provost Phillips, I'd like to know more about your campus-wide environmental initiative and want to check in with you on that. Let me offer just a little perspective of why we're here from the legislative point of view. And those of you who follow Oregon news know that the last 2 or 3 sessions have been eventful and striking for the events around proposed climate legislation that haven't been, how shall I say, fully harmonious or successful. They've been, in fact, the last 2 sessions quite divisive, quite contentious, quite difficult. And there's a lot that could be said about that. All I'll say right now is we're not going to be repeating that in the 2021 session. And yet it's really important to clarify that many of us in the legislature are fully committed to advancing Oregon as a model for climate action and greenhouse gas emission reduction in this country. That there's great work going on around the country. Possibly we'll see a greater initiative at the national level. But the states really have a role to play here. Oregon's really well positioned to be one of those states. And notwithstanding any setbacks of the last couple of years, we are determined to move forward. So so how do we do that in a practical way over the next 6 months as we meet in session? Well, one is that we're mindful of the lessons of the last couple of sessions. And one of those is that it's really a challenge to try to reduce emissions markedly over all of the different sectors, emitting sectors of an economy at the same time. And the 3 that stand out are transportation, industrial emissions, and generation of electricity. And while there are states that have taken on one of those, only one state so far has established a program that goes across all 3, and that's California. And our proposals the last couple of sessions were along California's lines. Well, this session, we're going to focus particularly on one of those sectors. Going after all 3 at once involves many complexities and moving parts. We want to build on one that has a good start already in Oregon, and that's decarbonization of the generation of electricity. And that's what we're about here today. You'll hear the phrase more than once today, probably, of 100% clean. So we want to understand, we want to share an understanding of what that means and what it means to completely decarbonize an electricity sector on the ground, how it would apply to Oregon life over coming years, what's needed, how you do it equitably, and in a way that addresses the different needs of different communities. The goal, as far as I'm concerned today, is to develop a foundation of facts and understanding of diverse perspectives that will make our job somewhat easier going forward over the next 6 months to try to fortify Oregon's path to carbon-free electricity. That's why we're here today. I'm really excited to do this. I think there's the potential to develop certainly more consensus than we've seen over the last 2 sessions when it comes to climate action, and a strategy that really fits Oregon well. So once again, with much thanks to the university and to those who made today possible, I will be seeing you in a later panel, and thank all of you for attending today.
Thank you so much, Senator. Our first presentation this morning is from Professor Greg Dotson, who will provide a brief overview of clean energy trends. Well, wait 1 second. There he is, Professor Dotson.
Great. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I will just share my screen and get started. So my name is Greg Dotson. I teach environmental law at the University of Oregon School of Law, and it's a pleasure to speak with you this morning about the trends in clean energy that are taking shape around the world and in the United States. My goal is just to provide a little bit of background information that can be useful for our first panel of state energy officials. In recent years, the world's energy systems have been undergoing a major transition. And the ways we power our homes and businesses, move our families, and take part in commerce are changing, and not just because of COVID. Some of the reasons for this transition you see here: technological advancement, changing economics, public demand, public health concerns. I don't think any driver is more important than climate change, though. It drives the urgency of the transition, and we see this with world leaders realizing that emissions need to be essentially eliminated in the coming decades in order to adequately respond to climate change. You can see this manifesting dramatically in the last 16 months. In September of 2019, more than 60 countries, including the European Union, announced that they would reduce their carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. And while this list contains some industrialized economies like Germany, in aggregate, these nations represented just 11% of global emissions. But in 2020, the list of nations pledging to reduce their emissions to net zero has grown impressively. In September, China surprised most everyone by pledging to be carbon neutral by 2060. In October, South Korea and Japan both pledged carbon neutrality by 2050. And to be clear, these nations are at different stages of this undertaking. While some countries like Germany, Norway, New Zealand, and Sweden have adopted laws to achieve these goals, other countries have draft legislation, policy statements, or just pledges with binding requirements yet to be established. President-elect Biden ran on the platform of rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and committing the United States to net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. This pledge will certainly receive additional attention in the months ahead, but if the US seriously pursues this policy, there is hope to think, as this article notes, that the Paris Climate Agreement's goal of avoiding the worst impacts of climate change is within striking distance. And when President-elect Biden's platform is included, nations accounting for 73% of the global economy have at least pledged at this point to have net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. So this is just a remarkable development over the last year and a half, and an indication that the energy transition that has been happening for years is now accelerating. Well, so how would policymakers go about achieving such an ambitious goal? Well, one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions is electricity generation. Because electricity is a large source of the emissions and is also widely viewed as the least challenging sector to decarbonize, it's a sector that's receiving focus abroad and here in the United States. When the electricity sector is cleaned up, not only are emissions reduced in that sector, it also enables emissions reductions in other sectors, such as transportation, which is responsible for another 28% of emissions in the United States. Here I have a photo of the Swan Island project recently announced by PGE and Daimler, in which electricity will be used to power medium and heavy duty vehicles manufactured here in Portland. I also have a photo of an electric heat pump, which can, of course, affordably reduce emissions from the residential and commercial sectors. So which states are pursuing clean electricity requirements? To date, 5 states have adopted what's known as a clean energy standard. These standards require an increasing percentage of electricity supplied by utilities within a state to be carbon-free. And carbon-free electricity is typically thought of as being generated by wind, solar, hydroelectric facilities. And some states include nuclear or possibly natural gas combined with carbon capture and sequestration. This has also rapidly advanced in the last few years. In 2018, California established a law to achieve 60% renewably generated electricity by 2030 and 100% clean electricity by 2045. Washington, New Mexico, and New York followed suit in 2019. While Washington and New Mexico matched the California goal of 2045, New York set a target date for 100% clean electricity by the year 2040. Each of these 4 states established their policies by law. Then in November of last year, the Arizona PUC voted to set a 100% clean electricity standard for 2050 for the utilities under its jurisdiction, which notably would not include municipally owned utilities or cooperatives. Some states have adopted 100% renewable electricity policies. And as the name suggests, this is similar to a clean energy standard, but specifies that electricity has to be generated solely from renewables resources. Hawaii did this in 2018, Maine and the District of Columbia followed in 2019. In 2020, Virginia adopted a 100% renewable electricity requirement for its 2 major utilities. And over the last 2 years, another 6 states have adopted goals for 100% clean energy by mid-century. While these goals are not legally binding, in many cases they follow on aggressive legally binding measures. So for instance, Colorado adopted laws for an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by its large utilities by 2030 and a legally binding requirement for 90% reduction economy-wide by 2050. So the state's goal of 100% clean electricity by 2040 falls squarely between these legally binding goals. Similarly, New Jersey and Nevada have legally binding requirements for 50% renewable electricity by 2030. Connecticut has a 40% renewable standard by 2030, and Rhode Island has established a 38.5% requirement for 2035. So why are these things happening? Well, first, these standards are being built on a foundation of established law and policy. The state of Iowa first established a Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, in 1983. And since then, 30 states, Washington, D.C., and 3 territories have adopted an RPS, while 7 states and 1 territory have set renewable energy goals. So stakeholders have generally become comfortable with the implementation of these policies, and the 100% clean energy standards are a seemingly logical outgrowth of these decade-old and established policies. In combination with other federal and state policies, we've seen strong growth in renewable energy and a major decline in coal consumption in the US. Coal consumption peaked around 2007 in the US and has been declining ever since. In 2020, it looks like we'll probably have used about as much coal as we did in 1965, which is something a remarkable development that no one really predicted even a decade ago. Another reason that clean electricity standards are getting traction is that renewable energy is simply increasing its competitiveness with traditional fossil fuels. This slide shows estimates of the levelized cost of energy for several types of generation. It was released by the firm Lazard in October as part of their annual assessment of the levelized cost of energy. And as you can see, the cost of utility scale solar now ranges between $31 and $42 per megawatt hour. Wind can range from $26 to $54 per megawatt hour. And this compares favorably to gas, combined cycle generation, which is from 44 to 73. In fact, a recent study from Berkeley found that generating 90% of the nation's electricity from clean sources by 2035 would actually reduce wholesale electricity prices by 10%. 100% clean energy standards are also advancing for one of the reasons Senator Golden spoke to, which is it leaves aside some contentious debates. For example, states believe that if you have a multi-decadal policy that isn't limited to renewables, you create windows for states to consider capital-intensive projects that otherwise might be hard to consider. For example, New York's standard provides that 70% of electricity must be from renewable sources by 2030, and that 100% of electricity must be clean by 2040s. And that potentially opens the ability to satisfy that final increment with nuclear power. If utilities know that in, say, 15 years, they'll need a significant amount of firm generation, they might take a look at whether projects that might not otherwise come within their planning window might make sense. Additionally, when the goal is 100% clean energy instead of incremental improvement, there's little reason not to count the carbon-free emissions of legacy hydro. And since the policy does not regulate gasoline, debates over gasoline prices are largely irrelevant. Finally, getting to 100% clean electricity generation is increasingly what electric utilities themselves envision for the future. Since 2016, utilities have increasingly been making pledges and plans for net zero carbon electricity. This map shows you the general location of the service territories of utilities that have made these pledges or something comparable, carbon neutrality or net zero or carbon-free electricity. They aren't being shown in chronological order, but you'll see they go from coast to coast and include Hawaii. Most utilities making this pledge aim to achieve it by a certain date between 2030 and 2050. And the list includes our own Portland General Electric, which just recently pledged to be net zero by 2040. And of course, some utilities are closer than others to actually achieving this goal. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll look forward to hearing the experts on the next panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Dotson, for that great presentation. Waiting now for our first panelist to queue up as they come on board. Our first panel today we'll be hearing from representatives of states who are currently implementing clean energy standards. And we're thankful to have Senator Michael Dembrow as the moderator of this panel. So welcome, Senator Dembrow.
Thank you very much, Heather. And thank you to the U of O for this ongoing partnership. Many people on this webinar may not know that this is not a new relationship that we have with this institute. You've been very helpful in the past. You know, Oregon has been working on clean energy and climate action for many years, and we have set very ambitious goals and have implemented a number of statutory changes and changes that are being developed through our executive branch, through executive order. And we see this quest for a 100% standard as being very much in line with that. This year, the Senate has created, it's split up the Committee on the Environment and Natural Resources, which I chaired for a few years, and we now have Energy and Environment as a separate committee. And I think that's in part a recognition of the work that we have ahead of us this session. We are going to be looking at legislation around energy resource adequacy, resiliency, better regional partnerships, and also looking at creating a 100% standard. Now, I want to back up and say that one of the beauties of our federal system is that states can serve as the laboratories of democracy. And we can try things out individually, ways of solving problems. You know, many of us have the same problems, but there are a number of different approaches to solving them. And each state can work on coming up with its own approach to solving those problems. But I will say that we often look to one another for inspiration, for experience, and for models that have been created. Legislators meet together in organizations like the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL, or NCEL, the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, to share ideas. We attend conferences, have meetings, such as this one, where we can, really learn from each other and adopt and adapt things that we've seen elsewhere. It's always easier to convince our colleagues to try something when it has been tried somewhere else, and to great success. So that's what we're looking for here in this panel. We're going to be hearing from 3 of our colleague states, which have been, taking very important steps in moving towards decarbonizing their electricity sectors. We're going to be hearing from Washington State, then New York State, and then New Mexico. We're going to be starting with Washington State, closest to home, our neighbor to the north. And, of course, what separates our 2 states is also something that makes us very similar, and that's the Columbia River and the enormous hydropower resource that we share there that really gives us, I will say, a leg up on many other states in terms of decarbonizing our electricity. Having that resource and being able to account for it really gives us a jump start in getting to 100% clean. So I'm really happy to start with Washington State, which has very recently taken important steps in this area. We have with us, we're lucky to have with us Sarah Vorpahl, who's with the Washington State Energy Office. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read in her bio, which is very impressive and a great way to kick this off. Sarah is a senior energy policy specialist at the Washington State Energy Office, where she's focused on distributed energy resources. She's currently working to implement Washington's new 100% clean energy mandate, what's called the Clean Energy Transformation Act, or what some people call CETA, and is serving as the lead on equity and low-income provisions. Sarah graduated with a PhD from the University of Washington in 2017, where she studied emerging solar cell materials in the lab of Professor David, I don't know if it's David Ginger. Her doctoral work also included a PhD concentration in public policy and management from the Evans School at the University of Washington. She also recently served on the staff of Senator Bernie Sanders, advising him on energy policy. So Sarah, if you would kick things off for us, tell us about the new program and about steps going forward. And I will say, everyone, that we'll be hearing from our three panelists first, and then we'll open things up to questions. Sarah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator, for that introduction. And really, to all the previous speakers, you teed me up perfectly for my talk today. So I really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk today about CETA. Thank you for giving us that acronym right off the bat, which is Washington's clean energy legislation that passed in 2019. So just very briefly, I come from the Department of Commerce, where we cover a broad range of work, not just energy, including things like local infrastructure planning, housing and homelessness, as well as other community services. So just to start at a very high level, the clean energy law, CETA, was part of a suite of pieces of legislation that came out of thinking about how to achieve the state's climate goals. So we have emissions limits that were set. They've actually recently been updated. So the graphic you're seeing here were the limits that were set when CETA was coming into law. The new limits came about in 2020. But as you can see, looking on the right hand of this graph, we have all these different types of legislation. So it's already been pointed out that electricity is kind of a big chunk and some of the lowest hanging fruit, but we also passed a clean building standard. We had a bill dealing with HFCs, and when we had some proposed legislation around clean transportation, including a low carbon fuel standard, which did not pass, but is going to be definitely up on the docket this year. So watch this space. But as you can see, the clean energy law, it's a big chunk. And so what's actually in there that's going to help us get those reductions? So the clean energy standard itself has a couple interim targets. So we have a 2025 eliminate coal. 2030 is our greenhouse gas neutral standard, which is again one of those interim steps that Professor Dotson talked about, where you have an 80%, so electricity, 80% of electricity has to come from renewable or not emitting. And in our case, not emitting, you can think nuclear. So that does count for us. And then there's 20% coming from alternative compliance options such as RECs. But there's a couple others as well. And then with a glide path to a 2045, 100% renewable or non-emitting, as we call it, clean standard. So I appreciated the distinguishing between the clean and the renewable standards. It's a very important distinction. And this builds on our existing renewable portfolio standard, which came about in the early 2000s in the Energy Independence Act. So you see that on the left-hand side, and it has a goal, had a goal of 15% renewable energy by 2020. And now we have the new goals in CETA, mandates in CETA that are coming online. Now, it may seem like a giant leap here in terms of the amount that we need to get done, but just noting that CETA includes legacy hydro and nuclear as qualifying resources. So if we think about the fuel mix for Washington, as was already mentioned, we are very hydro heavy. So we actually already have a very clean grid in a lot of ways, which puts us in a great position to actually be leading on 100% clean energy standard. In this graph, you'll see on the left an average for the state, and then in the middle, a representation of the average for the investor-owned utilities, and on the right, the consumer-owned utilities. So Commerce was responsible for writing laws associated with the COUs. And just to note some interesting things here, the IOUs have a much heavier lift off of some coal resources. And so they're about a little over 30% clean right now, whereas the COUs are largely BPA customers. So 65 total utilities in the state, 3 IOUs, the rest are COUs, and a lot of small co-ops and munis and PUDs in there. So those guys are, somewhere between 80% and even up to 100% clean already. So it is an interesting fact that there are kind of 2 use cases. Well, there's probably more like 40 use cases, but at least 2 use cases in the state, which makes this a really kind of sweeping law, but full of interesting complexities as well. So just to give you a little background, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, as I mentioned, was part of 2019 legislative session in this suite of clean energy laws. After that was signed into law, the agencies involved started pre-rulemaking kind of outreach and workshops. Commerce, we did 24 workshops over a year and a half, which turned virtual around February, but it was an incredibly broad effort with a lot of stakeholders at the table, some usual suspects, but also a whole suite of new stakeholders to engage, which was both very exciting and also challenging in our virtual times. Though I would say there is somewhat more of a democracy of access around virtual for the East Siders. So I think there was a lot of appreciation not having to schlep to Olympia all the time. So the final rule, I am proud to say, was just filed. And it is in. We made our December 31st statutory deadline. It'll be effective January 31st of this year. So just again, to highlight the fact that this is a very broad sweeping law. So there is the clean energy standard within CETA, but there's a lot of other stuff in here as well. And so there's many, many agencies involved. And I won't go through all the details, but just to say, Commerce has this role for consumer and utilities. We write rules to implement the chapter. However, enforcement and compliance happen with different agencies. So enforcement done by the Attorney General and compliance by the state auditor. The investor-owned utilities are regulated by the Utility Transportation Commission, who does all of those things. Ecology worked on some emissions protocols. Health is developing a cumulative impact assessment tool I'll talk about more in a minute. And labor, the Department of Labor worked on tax incentives for renewable energy. I won't talk much about those, but they are an important part of the equity conversation. So CETA broadly, we've kind of pinged on the clean part, it's in the title, but it's more than just a clean energy standard, right? It also includes ideas and provisions that speak to affordability and reliability, but also very importantly, an equitable transition. And so we kind of use this CARE acronym to talk about the different pillars of electricity now in our state. And I think the first 3 are pretty familiar to the utility space, but this equity piece is pretty new and it's an emerging field. It's very important, but there is a ton of work to be done. And so I'm actually very excited that this conference is happening at a research institute because I really think there's an important partnership between state agencies and the subject matter experts at research institutes that are going to help make these processes very robust. So I'm going to focus in on the equitable part because I was asked to focus in on that, and then I'll try to breeze through some of the other sweeping provisions as well. So when thinking about an equitable transformation, what does that mean? And what does it mean in CETA? The legislature found in the kind of overarching framework that the public interest now includes an equitable distribution. And it names that utilities must consider non-energy impacts in resource decisions. So things like environmental benefits and burdens, resilience, and some others that are named. Also just non-energy benefits broadly. That utilities have to assess the impacts of their decisions on vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities. Those are distinct named communities that are defined within CETA, and I won't go into those details today because of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about them. I'd like to flag that I think trying to have states line up around how we define priority communities is really important, and at least lining up within a state and your existing programs is also very important. The Clean Energy Standard itself incorporates equitable distribution goals, and you have to also incorporate a cumulative impact analysis looking at health disparities of climate change and fossil fuel production into long-term planning as a utility. So the rules we wrote provide a process for ensuring equitable distribution. So the words themselves are actually quite broad, but they are a mandate. And so there was a lot of work in the rulemaking to try to really figure out how to operationalize equity in terms of utility work. And so that was a unique challenge and one that stakeholders played a huge part in. And that those rules really look like explaining how to identify communities and develop indicators to identify those communities through a public process, as well as thinking about how to forecast the impacts of decisions and targets that are part of the clean energy work, specifically around energy efficiency, renewable energy, and demand response targets. As I said, it's brand new, right? So there was also a lot we did not get done in these administrative rules, even with 24 workshops and a year and a half in. And actually, this is where I think working with other states is going to be so critical. So there's just some really high level concepts that need fleshing out and need some robust analysis to support. And so Commerce came up with an informal guidance document. It's available on our website that really just sort of talks through all these ideas, and it was used as a resource to accompany our rules. And we're looking to use that as a place to continue to develop ideas and best practices. And so these are just some of the topics that we ended up covering. A particular note, public participation is one where it's not specifically named in terms of the law, but it is completely wrapped up in distributional equity. You have to think about procedural equity as well. There's also a really important but somewhat separate roadmap for dealing with low-income energy assistance programs. I think this is probably the place where the utilities feel most comfortable in terms of an equity conversation. In the Pacific Northwest, we have robust planning that involves, pursuing conservation, and there's a lot of work that BPA does to work with smaller utilities on energy incentives, energy efficiency incentive programs. But this mandates that utilities have to have program and funding available for low-income households, and that they need to prioritize those with high energy burden. So high energy burden is really the nexus, the focus of this conversation in a way that it has not been before. And I think that's really important, especially in a state with very cheap retail rates, because it can sometimes be an illusion that cheap retail rates means there's not people that that everyone can just afford their energy because there's cheap rates, but that is not always true. The work also requires an assessment of energy burden and adequacy of energy assistance programs, including targeting, language access, and consultation with tribes. And it requires Commerce to collect data on a biennial basis from utilities, as well as we'll be leaning on the Department of Energy's low-income energy affordability data tool. And if you're not familiar, please get in touch. I'd love to show you it. It's a great resource. And so I'm going to kind of breeze through the rest of this. I know I'm kind of short on time. At its heart, CETA is also a planning document, and we're really changing the way, it really changes the way utilities have to think about planning in terms of their clean energy acquisition. So there's a new clean energy implementation plan that's done every 4 years. It sets specific targets for renewable energy, energy efficiency, and demand response. And the demand response piece is just brand new. So similarly, an emerging field where we need more information. As I mentioned, it includes this distributional equity piece, public process for development, and importantly, it provides a simplified approach, the opportunity for a simplified approach in our rules for small utilities and full requirements customers of BPA. So this was an existing delineation that we had in the Energy Independence Act, and we'll continue to move forward through CETA because it's really important that we're meeting utilities where they're at, and while we're pushing the mandate across the board in the state, that we're also doing it in a way that is actually doable for our smaller capacity utilities. And then every 4 years, there's a compliance look back report. So the auditor is doing, the compliance, but there's a compliance reporting that's due to Commerce as well to say, how'd y'all do? And then, as I mentioned, it's, affordable and reliable are also important aspects. There's going to be work around resource adequacy. There is a provision that limits the growth of compliance costs to 2% of retail rates to protect from rate shock. There's going to be a regular assessment of reliability by Commerce in consultation with experts to allow, an analysis of how this law is affecting the state's reliability. And there is a provision that would allow a temporary suspension of the law if we think reliability is being threatened. And then there's also work with a markets work group to align cap and trade states and really think about the market aspects, which are huge and unfortunately not my cup of tea, but a really big and important part of this conversation. So just very briefly, some of the implementation challenges. As I mentioned, equity, brand new. We have to get everyone on the same table to have this conversation. And I really think we've gotten there because the utilities have been very curious and wanting to understand what this means. And so I'm really thankful to those folks, as well as the advocates who have really pushed us to think about this work in a very robust way. We're shifting from just oversight and getting a report every couple of years to now actually thinking about planning, which is kind of brand new, and especially with these new clean energy implementation plans. As I mentioned, there's a kind of a split authority in our state, very similar to Oregon as well. So I think it's has been so important for us to work really well together and then understand how the different governance structures of our agencies require different kinds of roles. And then, as I mentioned, some more work around organized markets that need to happen, the role of small utilities, the role of the elected boards, the governing boards that, are going to be passing these clean energy implementation plans is really important. So thinking about the governance structure for publics and how to write rules that really make sure it's rooted in the way that work gets done already in the state. And then it's a brand new set of challenges and opportunities for staff, right? So lots of new work. I'm personally really excited about it. So I just think it's a great opportunity to really push us towards these important climate justice conversations. Very briefly, we had 2 other reports as part of CETA. We were required to do a state energy strategy update. It is officially released. You can see it. It's beautiful and wonderful on our website. We were also asked to do something called an Energy and Climate Policy Advisory Committee to work with our state's research institutions to think about some of our clean energy program gets done and how to improve it going forward to support the implementation goals of CETA. And not that we're done. We have tons and tons of future work. A lot of stuff came out during our time that we were not able to find an answer to or consensus on as a way to move forward. The biggest one I think of which is the interpretation of a use of electricity in that 2030 standard. So, when we're talking about using clean energy, are we thinking about tracking it on an hour by hour basis, or do we look at it averaged every 4 years? And what's in between hourly versus 4-year look back. So, I think there's a lot more conversation to be had between our agencies and stakeholders on that one. We're going to be including definitions for low income and energy assistance need, which we had wanted to make sure to establish through some stakeholder processes and understanding after the reporting what made the most sense. There's a lot of other things, accounting for energy storage, which is not named but is certainly a part of CETA. Some work groups, including a market work group and a transmission corridor work group, and then some other pieces as well. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for your time today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other states as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And we've already some questions coming in, and I look forward to sharing them with you and delving further. So our next speaker is from New York State. It's Corinne DiDomenico, who's with the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA. Corinne joined NY, I don't know, how do you say it? Do you say
NYSERDA.
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 NYSERDA, okay. Yeah, Corinne joined NYSERDA as Assistant Director of Large-Scale Renewables, focusing on cross-cutting policy development activities, clean energy standard implementation, and programmatic reporting. She also oversees the New York Generation Attribute Tracking System. Prior to joining NYSERDA, she managed the long-term contracting procurements for clean energy for National Grid, leading the strategic execution of a $16 billion portfolio that included over 2,000 megawatts of clean energy, including offshore wind, land-based wind, hydro, solar, and anaerobic digestion. From 2005 to 2009, she held various positions in power engineering, generating plant operations, both steam and gas turbine, and maintenance services. Corinne received a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Drexel University and an MBA from CUNY Baruch. And Corinne, it's a real pleasure to have you. Wish we could have you here in Oregon in person, either in Portland or Eugene, but this, I have to say, is probably more convenient for you.
Yes.
But we're really grateful that you're giving us your time.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. And if you bear with me, I'll share my screen here.
So what's going on in New York?
The weather's not too bad here today, but we've got lots going on. Okay, so can you see my screen? All right. Well, good morning. It's afternoon out here, but thank you again for having me. I'm very happy to be here to hear about all the exciting work that's going on and to hear about what Oregon's working on. Again, I'm Corinne DiDomenico. I won't repeat my bio, so thank you very much. I thought before I dive into our clean energy standard, I'd sort of just do a little bit of level setting for where New York is, how far we've come and how much more we need to go. Our 2018 renewable energy report was put out last year. We'll be putting out our 2019 annual report. We go through our, as the Senator mentioned, I oversee our attribute tracking system, which tracks all of our generation attributes to record. And so we go through a settlement process, and that's now settled, and we'll be releasing our new report next year for 2019. But as you can see here, New York has already made quite a bit of progress. We're already at almost 27% renewable, made up largely of hydroelectric. We also have 30% of zero emissions resources and about 40% of non-renewables. You can see here very little as of 2018 was made up of wind and solar, but we've certainly made some significant efforts to push that portfolio even further. And so as you can see here, since 2017, we've awarded almost 69 projects of over 6,000 megawatts of renewable energy projects achieved through our procurements. This is here, I wanted to actually spend a little bit of time here because I think the geography and technology types are of significance, which I'll talk about later. You can see here a lot of our portfolio is not only made up of wind, but of course, as I think we're seeing across the nation, a pickup of solar projects. Again, this only focuses on our large scale projects. This does not include our distributed systems. You can also see that a lot of our resources are focused in the upstate region, very little downstate in New York City and Long Island for obvious reasons, real estate, cost of development. However, we do have our 2 offshore wind projects of the Empire Wind and Sunrise Wind. And of course, we have a smattering of energy storage projects associated with some of those. And I put up in the top right-hand corner just a breakdown of our load zones, because I'll be talking a little bit about Zone J, which is the New York City area later, again, to talk about sort of the strategies and to achieve our goals and how to get there if sort of, you know, the market is answering to the sort of most economic, easy to site places, how we can drive incentives to get to projects to where we need them. So in June of 2019, we passed the Climate Act. It has several aspects to that. Oh, excuse me, my computer froze a little bit there. I'll be focusing mainly on the large scale renewable and the percentage of renewable energy, but clearly here it's a large comprehensive act to achieve to our carbon neutral economy, which includes several specific goals for renewable energy, which include 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar, our 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, as well as our 3,000 megawatts of energy storage. All of this to achieve our 70% renewable energy by 2030, and of course our 100% zero emission goal by 2040. The CLCPA again was a very large, comprehensive energy legislation, but it included several requirements, which I'll be talking about later for our clean energy standard. But I'd be remiss not to talk about how much of a focus, as Sarah just mentioned for her state, as our legislation focused on equity and a just transition. It established the Climate Action Council, which is to come up with a scoping plan, excuse me, to get us to our clean energy goals. We also have a Just Transition Working Group, which is also an advisory panel to the Climate Action Council to ensure just transition. The Act actually specifically requires that no less than 35% of any benefits are attributed to disadvantaged communities, and as well as our programs not to disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And so in every sort of thing that we work on, equity and is always a big piece of what we are focusing on. Make sure that no one's left behind. As well as in the CLCPA, it had a requirement to establish a program, the Clean Energy Standard, to achieve our 70 by 30 and put us on a path to our 100 by 40, which I'll be focusing on here today. Okay. So we already had an existing clean energy standard, which was working under our pre-existing framework of 50% renewable by 2030 prior to the Act. So we essentially had to align our clean energy standard with the Climate Act. And so we put out an estimate of our 2030 load, which is obviously represents a decrease in today's load, even with electrification. I think our 2018 load was probably around 157 gigawatt hours. It's assumed to be 151,000 megawatt hours based on various assumptions, which I'll provide some resources if there's any questions on any of these matters. But the easy part is starting with an assumed 30% non-renewable, then working our way up from our current renewable energy portfolio, as well as what's already under contract. This includes all of those projects that I just showed before, as well as our distributed energy resources. But it also showed we've got quite a ways to go here. We've got 11.5 gigawatts of land-based renewables, 4.5 gigawatts of offshore wind, as well as over 3 gigawatts of distributed energy. And while storage is not sort of directly contributing to our goals, I also just showed sort of where we are today with our energy storage goals, with 93 megawatts of storage operating today. We've made quite a bit of progress with over 800 megawatts under contract, but in order to get to that 3,000 megawatt goal, we've got quite a ways to go. And I'll talk about in the end about how much we need that storage. So it's very critical to getting to where we need to go by 2040 and beyond. Another act that came out in the spring of last year, and I'm sure like everybody else, I've sort of lost track of time since last March, but I think it came out in the beginning of last year. We also had the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth Act. There are sort of three major components, which we see as like a companion legislation to the Climate Act, because it really gives us a lot of the tools we need to reach our goals. It establishes the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which is meant to drive responsible and cost-effective siting and streamlined approach for energy projects going forward. We've got the Build Ready program, which is meant to identify projects that maybe aren't the most attractive to typical renewable energy projects. And a lot of the upfront development work is done that can be made available to developers, as well as the State Power Grid Study and Program, which again identifies another challenge, if you will, to study the existing infrastructure on the distribution and transmission level, to the investments that need to be made to bring the infrastructure to what it needs to deliver the renewable energy that we'll be requiring. So in late last year in October, or in the fall of last year, the Commission adopted an expansion to the Clean Energy Standard. As I mentioned, it brought the Clean Energy Standard into alignment with the CLCPA and adopted our 70 by 30 goal. It narrowed the definition of renewable energy per the Climate Act, which actually removed biomass from eligibility as a renewable energy system. Most importantly, it set procurement targets for our two sort of anchor procurement trajectories for Tier 1, and I'll explain the tiers later, which is our land-based large-scale renewable program. So this way the market sees a signal that from 2021 to 2026, NYSERDA will be going out every year and looking for approximately 4,500 gigawatt hours of renewables. So we're really hoping, of course, that not only does this get us to our 70 by 30 goal, but shows to the market that we've got a lot of work to do here and this is an attractive place to do business. As well as our offshore wind goals in order to meet our 9,000 megawatt goal, but also to achieve our 70 by 30, we're going to need to be on a path of procurement of about the same 4,500 gigawatt hours per year over the next few years from 2020 to 2023. All of these numbers are sort of including some estimated attrition because again, we've got to achieve our 70 by 30. And again, if you've had any questions about these numbers, I'm very happy to point you to our white paper, which explained all of our assumptions here. It also introduced two new tiers, or two new programs, I will, under a clean energy standard. One, a program designed to incent and deliver renewable energy into New York City. Two, a competitive tier 2 program, which is meant for our baseline or existing renewables. We call our existing renewables pre-2015 our baseline renewables, which again are those hydro, mostly made up of those hydroelectric resources, as well as wind that were previously under contract with NYSERDA, which are either rolled off of contract or expecting to roll off of contract, as well as a path for repowering projects under our tier 1 program. So here I just give, excuse me, a snapshot of all of our programs. Tier 1 is really our primary mechanism to deliver newly constructed and developed renewable energy projects. This typically includes land-based wind, solar, small hydro. Over time, we've seen it move from a wind portfolio to solar as the market matures and costs come to a place where solar is more competitive now. And this has really been driving our new development. Our second largest is, of course, our offshore wind program. To again, reach our 9 gigawatt goal. We also have a tier 2 maintenance program, which was pre-existing, which is really sort of a custom or bespoke sort of filing that an existing renewable generator could sort of petition the commission for support to stay online. And so that program has always been around. This competitive tier 2 program was really to drive competition amongst these resources. There is competition for these resources and voluntary programs, neighboring regional markets for RECs, as well as well, community choice aggregations, which are picking up quite significantly in New York. And so it's a short-term program, 3 years for 3-year contracts, but we believe it's necessary to keep that program competitive and also support these existing programs. Then we have tier 3, which is really our zero emissions credits program. They are not considered renewables for purposes of 70 by 30, but certainly would count toward our 100% zero emissions by 2040. And our tier 4 program, which is really quite unlike anything before under our programs, because of the sort of the tale of two grids is what we call. The NYSO had a big report out and they called the tale of two grids. Upstate is quite renewable compared to downstate, which is particularly reliant on fossil fuel generation. And also in the same vein of driving investments to places where here, New York City is our biggest load center. Communities that have been particularly dependent on fossil fuel generation, we're driving renewable energy deployment to where these disadvantaged communities can reap the benefits of these renewable energy projects. And the program requires renewable energy system to be located in New York City or also to be delivered to New York City through new transmission. And so we are looking to issue that RFP in the coming month and hoping to see some really good projects to drive renewable energy there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of beyond 2030, not that I've got a crystal ball by any means, so please don't think I've got a whole bunch of secrets here. But of course, New York State has taken a look at this. We've got our pathway study, which I've included a link to in my resources. which really studied New York State and how to get to our long-term goals. Clearly, electrification of buildings and transportation is going to drive significant increase in our electric demand. We actually see New York State shift from a summer peak to a winter peak around 2040, which is driven primarily through electrification of buildings and transportation. So how do we get to decarbonizing the energy sector? Of course, energy efficiency and managed electrification is going to be critical to that. New York State has significant potential renewable energy resources, not only through adjoining states and regional transmission systems, but of course through the addition of in-state renewable development. We see a critical need for battery storage, demand-side flexibility, long duration battery storage. I think is going to be everyone's sort of Shangri-La and what we need here. We've also got access to a number of firm zero carbon resources, which could help some of these balancing. This would include hydro, renewable natural gas, well, we hope in the future. And of course, transmission investments, as I noted, also distribution are going to be needed to deliver on this. We need the grid to deliver on these resources to help maintain and get to where we need to go. So again, just provided here some links that might be helpful. I think the pathway study is pretty interesting for anyone that's just interested in looking far out into the future. But again, I think all of our futures look pretty similar. And so I think we're all working as we started off here with getting to the same goal, this 100%. And we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions during the Q&A part.
Yes, thank you very much, Corinne. And yes, we do have questions that have come in that you've opened up some doors for us that I look forward to coming back to. I just want to say I really envy the quick start that you're getting on the offshore wind front. It helps to have shallow waters there. We have a challenge of deep waters. But now we're going to move to a state that has no waters. They have, I don't think, any options for offshore wind, Erin, but you do have other resources at your disposal. Our final speaker is Erin Taylor from New Mexico. And Erin joined the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department Energy Conservation and Management Division, which is also simply known as the New Mexico State Energy Office. She joined it in December of 2019. As the Energy Planning and Program Bureau Chief, Erin manages the state energy program and oversees program efforts related to climate sustainability and resilience, grid modernization, alternative fuel and electric vehicles, economic and energy diversification, and energy conservation and renewable energy financial incentives. Erin has over 10 years of experience in project planning and management with an emphasis on environmental compliance and mine reclamation. She has led reclamation efforts on multiple high priority abandoned mine land sites throughout New Mexico. She earned a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the Pennsylvania State University and a Master of Science in Environmental Policy and Management from University of Denver. Erin, thank you very much for giving us your time here. And tell us about the unique situation in New Mexico in a lot of ways, but as well as the the really exciting, ambitious plans that are underway there. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me get my slides up there. I hope those are showing. So good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting New Mexico to speak on the Energy Transition Act, ETA, a complex bill that moves New Mexico towards cleaner electricity generation, clear the way for the state's largest utility to close one of the state's largest coal-fired power plants, and provide instruments for a just transition in the economically affected communities. Coal-fired power plants provide the largest share of New Mexico's electricity generation, but that share has steadily declined in recent years. In response to strict air quality regulations, more competitively priced natural gas supplies, and California's decision in 2014 to stop purchasing coal-fired generation from other states, New Mexico's coal-fired power generation has declined by 44% since 2013. Natural gas-fired power plants now account for more than 1/3 of New Mexico's net generation. Renewable resources, primarily wind, almost all the rest. New Mexico passed the ETA in 2019. The landmark legislation set bold statewide renewable energy standards and established a pathway for a low carbon energy transition away from coal, while providing workforce training and transition assistance to affected communities. The ETA sets a statewide renewable energy standard of 50% by 2030, 80% by 2040, and 100% carbon-free mandate for utilities by 2045 and rural electric cooperatives by 2050. The legislation outlines several policy tools to assist in the implementation. The first tool provides a process for private bonding authority for an entity closing a coal plant. Some utilities, such as PNM, have substantial coal plant costs, approved for recovery but still on their books to be paid off over decades. The legislation uses a tool that was not previously available to the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, the PRC, to better protect customers while requiring the utility to have a shared responsibility, a low-cost financing mechanism to pay off coal plant costs early and close the facilities. This is often referred to as securitization. Securitization is like refinancing a mortgage at a lower rate. The lower interest bonds reduce the overall cost of closing coal plants by as much as 40%. Securitization allows the utility to issue debt with collateral, so it ends up being less expensive financing. The ETA permits utilities that are transitioning out of coal-fired generation to use customer payments as collateral to finance their transition. With low-cost bonds secured by a surcharge on customer bills, the effective interest rates charged to customers can change from 8 to 9% to 3 to 4%. From a ratepayer perspective, after the coal plant closes and is replaced with mostly renewables and the costs are bonded, residential bills can be reduced as much as $7 a month or 10%. The second tool reinvests in clean energy and property tax replacement. The bill directs hundreds of millions of dollars of replacement power to be determined by the PRC to be developed. The development can help to restore the tax base for the community and its schools after the San Juan generating station closes, and will provide substantial economic activity for many years to come. The higher RPS goals will also provide substantial opportunities throughout the state for the development of renewable resources and energy storage. The bill requires the PRC to approve storage projects that reduce costs to customers and facilitate the integration of renewable energy where they are the lowest cost option among feasible alternatives. The third tool focuses on the creation of apprenticeship opportunities in all types of energy development areas. New Mexico's economy will be bolstered by a large renewable energy build-out with a local workforce trained to supply the needed labor. There will be a great deal of new construction in the state, renewable energy and storage projects, starting now through at least 2050, in order for utilities and cooperatives to meet the RPS standards. The bill requires a minimum apprenticeship requirement, 10% on projects before 2024, 17.5% for projects beginning prior to 2026, and 25% for projects beginning after 2026. The last tool created 3 funds, one at Indian Affairs, one at Economic Development, and one at Workforce Solutions to assist affected communities. In addition to these funds, the ETA allows a company to use securitization to provide severance packages to plant and mine workers, along with direct training opportunities. New Mexico communities impacted by the San Juan generating station coal plant closure will receive $40 million in economic relief, $20 million in direct severance and training to plant and mine workers, and $20 million to assist the affected communities. The ETA establishes new renewable and zero carbon emission portfolio standards for both utilities and rural electric cooperatives. The ETA renewable and clean energy requirements are 20% by 2020, 40% by 2025, 50% by 2030, and for IOUs, 80% by 2040, and 100% zero carbon resources by 2045. And PNM has stated that it will meet that requirement by 2040. For rural electric cooperatives, they have a 100% zero carbon resource mandate by 2050, composed of at least 80% renewable energy. So given this information, what is the status of New Mexico's coal-fired electric generating stations? Tri-State Generation and Transmission decommissioned the Escalante generating station in August of 2020. It was not eligible for ETA securitization since its decommissioning was not under the PRC purview. Tri-State set aside $5 million for local economic development, and in 2020, the governor signed legislation, the Economic Generating Facility Economic District Act, that would allow counties with a fossil fuel generating facility that is operating, retiring, or retired to form a district in which the governing authority can issue bonds for infrastructure within the district and pledge revenues for the repayment of those bonds. In addition to phasing out of the San Juan generating station by 2022, PNM recently announced its plan to divest at a second plant, the Four Corners generating station, by 2024. PNM's share in the plant represent 10% of its energy production and are the company's last remaining investments in coal. In an unexpected turn, PNM announced in June that it would not purchase its expiring leases at the Palo Verde nuclear facility in Arizona in favor of pursuing cheaper renewable energy technologies. When it comes to replacing the power at Palo Verde and Four Corners, PNM is leaning heavily towards a mix of gas and renewables. As previously mentioned, the ETA established 3 distinct funds to assist the affected areas. The ETA created 3 funds that sit within 3 state departments. $12 million to the Department of Workforce Solutions, $6 million to the the Economic Development Department, and $2 million to the Indian Affairs Department. Each department will administer its fund informed by the Community Advisory Committee and the public planning process. The 3 state departments, in cooperation with local committee conveners, partnered to solicit requests for information from parties interested in working with the state to diversify the economy of the San Juan County. The request for information asked for proposals to create economic activity for the region that focus on collaboration and tangible results in long-term job creation. Proposals before the ETA Community Advisory Committee, who met in mid-December, demonstrate just how impactful ETA investments in local and tribal communities can be, and how essential community coordination and collaboration is in getting buy-in and understanding of the local community's needs. The projects will do more than just replace lost jobs. They will create a diversified and resilient economy built on the skills and resources of local and native people. Electricity consumption in New Mexico is fairly evenly distributed among the commercial, industrial, and residential sectors, with the commercial sector using the most electricity. 1 in 5 New Mexican households use electricity as the primary source for home heating. New Mexico uses less electricity per capita than 2/3 of other states. Because New Mexico consumes less electricity than it produces, the state is a net supplier of electricity to neighboring states. Given the high quality and potential of our solar and wind resources, we expect this trend to continue with our transition to renewable electricity. Because these resources are not always located in the same place as previously operating power plants, New Mexico needs to develop additional transmission capacity, power lines, to carry our renewables within and beyond our borders. In July 2020, the New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority completed a study of transmission needs over the next 12 years. The study found increasingly high voltage transmission lines by 900 to 1,300 miles could spur development of at least 11,500 megawatts of renewable generation in New Mexico by 2032, more than enough to meet the interim clean energy sales by 2030. New Mexico currently has over 9,300 miles of transmission lines. Projects underway to move these electricity supplies include new transmission lines that take advantage of the state's location on the edge of 3 U.S. electric grids, the Eastern, Western, and Texas interconnections, and the Four Corners Power Trading Hub, located in the Four Corners Coal Complex in northwestern New Mexico. Transmission projects include the Lucky Corridor and the Western Spirit Transmission, which are designed to allow delivery of electricity generated from renewable resources to New Mexico customers and those in other Western states. New Mexico is also home to a significant portion of the SunZia project, a 520-mile transmission corridor designed to transport electricity generated from wind and solar energy to Western power markets. The SunZia project is expected to be in service by 2024. Another project, the South Line Transmission Project, is in development. It will add new and update existing transmission lines across southwestern New Mexico and Arizona. 2 days ago, Pattern Energy announced it had completed financing and started the full construction process of its Western Spirit transmission line and its suite of Western Spirit wind power projects totaling totaling over 1,000 megawatts, located in central New Mexico. The projects are targeted for commercial operation by the end of 2021. The Western Spirit wind projects will utilize a total of 377 wind turbines. The wind projects will be constructed in conjunction with the Western Spirit transmission line, an approximately 150-mile transmission line that will add much needed accessibility for New Mexico's powerful wind resources and the electricity grid in New Mexico and broader Western markets. Since the passage of the ETA in 2019, 11 renewable energy projects have come online with a total capacity of 268 megawatts. And there was a total of 15 projects online by the end of 2020, resulting in a total added renewable energy capacity of 1,346 megawatts. In May 2020, ground was broken on a La Jolla, New Mexico wind turbine facility in Torrance County with a capacity of 306 megawatts. La Jolla's power has been bought by PNM, which should help bring it closer to its ETA goals. 166 megawatts of the La Jolla electricity will go to the Facebook data center in Los Lunas, while an additional 140 megawatts will increase the percentage of renewables on New Mexico's grid. The single largest wind power farm in New Mexico went operational at the end of December, about 20 miles south of Portales, New Mexico. Xcel Energy will flip the switch on 240 wind turbines at the Sagamore Wind Project, which can produce 522 megawatts, enough electricity to power 194,000 homes. In 2020, the PRC unanimously approved a plan to add renewable energy and storage to replace a portion of the San Juan generating station's capacity owned by PNM. The portfolio includes 650 megawatts of new solar resources and 300 megawatts of battery storage, totaling over $1 billion in investments within the district impacted by the San Juan plant closure. In May 2020, the PRC approved construction of 2 new solar projects, including one with backup battery storage to provide El Paso Electric Company with another 250 megawatts of renewable electricity, bringing it closer to its ETA goals. The new solar projects will come online in 2022. New Mexico has substantial renewable resources, particularly from wind and solar. There is a significant wind potential in the high plains in the eastern half of the state. In 2018, wind energy contributed almost 19% of New Mexico's electricity generation, and by late 2019, the state had more than 2,000 megawatts of installed electricity generating capacity from more than 1,100 wind turbines. In March 2020, for the first time since early 2018, New Mexico's utility scale electricity generation from renewables surpassed coal-fired generation. In fact, in March 2020, renewable energy as a whole, including both utility scale and small scale solar, was responsible for more than a third of the state's electricity generation. Over 850 megawatt hours of electricity was generated from renewable resources in March. This is the highest level of generation from renewables ever recorded in the state. While the third quarter generation has come primarily from fossil fuels, this pattern is part of the yearly cycle of wind generation in eastern New Mexico. New Mexico continues to see new and innovative ideas regarding clean energy policies. Beyond the ETA and as directed by the governor's executive order on addressing climate change and energy waste prevention, New Mexico is evaluating the adoption of a comprehensive market-based program that sets emission limits to reduce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas pollution, consistent with the objectives of achieving a statewide reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of at least 45% by 2030. New Mexico is evaluating comprehensive market-based program options and will design and implement the most efficient and cost-effective approaches to meeting our climate goals. Our evaluation includes coordinating with neighboring states as well as those that are already implementing market-based programs, and this will be a priority for stakeholder engagement in 2021. The Energy Grid Modernization Roadmap directs the state to develop a strategic plan for energy grid modernization and to establish a competitive grant program to support implementation of eligible grid modernization projects. The grant program will be supported by a new grid modernization grant fund, enabling the state to pursue federal funding from sources previously unavailable. The bill also encourages utilities to bring forward proposals for a reliable and up-to-date electricity grid to meet growing renewable energy needs. To achieve the ambitious goals laid out in the ETA, we need to make sure our infrastructure is updated and expanded. As the transition to zero carbon resources presents several challenges to the reliability of our energy supply and the stability of our current grid infrastructure, using the Energy Grid Modernization Roadmap to guide electricity service providers, regulators, policymakers, and consumers will be imperative to meet the goals of the ETA. New Mexico's Regulation and Licensing Department acted in 2020 to adopt new international, international energy conservation codes for both residential and commercial buildings, increasing required efficiency levels from the 2009 levels to the 2018 levels. These updated codes will affect new buildings and major renovation projects permitted after March 2021. The Pacific Northwest National Laboratory estimates that for New Mexico, switching from the 2009 levels to the 2018 codes will save a typical single-family homeowner over $400 per year, and multifamily homeowners over $100 per year, excuse me. These efficiencies will also result in significant reductions in electricity consumption, helping the state meet its ETA goals. We are anticipating seeing even more proposed legislation touching on clean energy initiatives in 2021. I want to thank you for inviting New Mexico to speak today, and I've included my contact information and look forward to the questions and future conversations.
Hey, thank you very much. I told you that was a state on the move. Boy. Let me start out. We've received a number of questions that are kind of, related to the jobs and economic development front. And, I will say that as a legislator, two things that we're always preoccupied with is job creation, economic development within our states, as well as budget. That is, how do we actually pay for the programs that we're creating? I wonder if you could each talk a little bit more about how your programs are incentivizing, through direct state action, local economic development. Aside from the work of, the goals that you're creating, which are encouraging, investments in renewables. What are you doing to encourage investments in renewables in your states? That's something I know a lot of people are concerned about. So let's start with that, and then we'll go to the budget question. So whoever wants to jump in.
Well, sure, I can start. New York State certainly sees this as an opportunity for economic development, even more so in the current COVID-19 times, to sort of an economic recovery. All of our programs seek to give preference to projects that drive economic benefits within the state. We've had the establishment of many workforce development programs, our Offshore Wind Training Institute being one of them. Through this most recent CES order, it requires NYSERDA to continue the good work that we've been doing by requiring workforce development opportunities, project labor agreements, in particular with projects that need timely delivery. And in addition to our disadvantaged communities, where before maybe, where we want economic development benefits, we also want them now geared more toward disadvantaged communities. But certainly we see the opportunity there and continue to build on that even more so.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I had mentioned very quickly that the Department of Labor was writing rules for tax incentives for renewable energy projects. So within the Clean Energy Transformation Act, there are incentives for projects that have high labor standards, including, PLAs, and as well as for women and minority-owned businesses. So, this is a mechanism that has been used other times in the state, and I think we've already seen at least one project that's been able to take advantage of those tax incentives, which is great. In addition, and actually Erin's presentation helped me think about this too, to CETA, we also have a program in the state called the Clean Energy Fund, which is been around for about 6 years now. It's a bucket of money that has, or it's several buckets of money that have priorities around grid modernization, electrified transportation systems, grants for nonprofit lenders to incentivize renewable energy and energy efficiency upgrades. We also have retrofits on public buildings and energy efficiency and solar grants as well. So we have kind of this nice suite of programs that support the ideas behind the Clean Energy Transformation Act. And very recently, as part of some of the provisions in CETA, we recently did sort of a large review of how those programs have been working, really especially with the equity issues, right? Are like we meeting our policy outcomes when it comes to access to that money, and are they actually doing what we want? So, we're starting to pivot this year for the proposed budget and the governor's proposed budget. There's another bucket for electrifying buildings. So, and then an increased interest in community resilience. So we're continuing to pivot that bucket of money towards the goals that we see emerging as folks are trying to comply with CETA. So it's not directly part of funding through CETA, but it is definitely part of the larger suite of clean energy law and funding in the state.
And when you say community resilience, are you talking about distributed energy projects there, or what are you thinking of specifically?
Yeah, no, it's hard to come up with a specific definition of community resilience, right? It's so holistic in terms of what it means, but generally speaking, the idea we have in our minds is something around like a community resilience hub. So a well-used and well-trusted community center or school that can include clean energy solutions that help sustain it during blackout and other extreme conditions, and can then provide resources in the community. The reason I'm so broad in speaking about this is that these things are defined by community priorities, by communities themselves. So that co-development process is really what's going to set the standards for, which pieces of critical load or critical infrastructure these projects would be centered around. And that would be a large part of that conversation too.
Yeah. Erin, did you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. So for New Mexico, we have several tax incentive financing options for renewable energy, buildings, solar. We saw over 25 proposals come into the Energy Transition Act Committee in December. Several were public education institutions focusing on new and innovative education models and training opportunities. We also applied for CARES Act money in a few months ago that we just got, and that is obviously for post-COVID recovery, but we're also looking at it from the angle of diversifying the economy through clean energy. But we also have efforts going on about a just transition and what does that look like. So there aren't winners and losers in the state as we go through this transition. And we have a report, our New Mexico Workforce Solutions came up with a clean energy workforce development study in 2020 that I can share that focuses on those efforts.
So a couple of you mentioned transmission and the challenges of transmission, as you're switching to renewables. Can you say something about, how you're planning for that, and maybe also touching on, so that also opens the sticky wicket of land use decisions, right? Do you find yourself, running into problems there in terms of siting decisions, both for transmission and for renewable projects? Anybody want to say anything about that? Shed some wisdom for us.
Well, I wouldn't say I have wisdom. I would say that we have a mechanism to answer those questions eventually. So I do find it interesting. Transmission ends up being one of those things that we kind of future us will take care of, but it's so important to the conversation. And it's also difficult because the governance around it has so many different levels of people involved, and it's not always clear, who's on first with that one. So we have a transmission work group that's part of CETA that the Energy Facilities Siting Commission will be responsible for running, and that'll have a wide range of stakeholders that have been named within CETA. So the hope there is to have a more kind of centralized conversation around, either creating some kind of transition corridor mapping or just, a picture of what we actually need. I'm so interested in this potential study that New Mexico did and noted that because it's really important to understand, especially given the fact that so much of our solar and renewable energy resources come from the east side, where a lot of our load is on the west side. And so siting over the mountains is very difficult. Siting new transmission is very difficult. And that continues to then push a conversation around standalone storage, non-wire solutions, et cetera. But we do know we're going to need something, right? And we're also, for some of us, in the last little bit of the percent of renewable energy where it starts getting expensive and, the hockey puck stick goes up or whatever. And so for the siting, one thing that has come up is around kind of a least conflict siting map. California did some work around this, I think in the central part of the state, but it's basically working with a broad coalition of stakeholders to understand, so folks that represent farming and agricultural interests, political interests, renewable energy interests, and be able to create a map for the state of where it's actually possible and politically feasible to site renewable energy projects. I would also say that our state's Department of Natural Resources is really leading on thinking about putting renewables on public lands and looking at the opportunities there. So we just had a huge solar project that was okayed down in the southern part of the state, where we typically have a lot of wind there along the river, but the Columbia River Basin, but we haven't done so much solar, but there's so much solar asset down there. So that's a really great opportunity as well. So I don't have wisdom other than that it takes a statewide coalition, a broad coalition, to think about like the holistic needs around planning. And CETA at least envisioned that was going to be important.
Corinne, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I covered a little bit about the Renewable Energy Growth Act, how in sort of response to those challenges, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting has now been created. Sort of like as Sarah said before, we've developed the Build Ready program, which is meant to take those least desirable sites that developers are maybe hesitant to go after, that the state could then take some initial sort of action on to then make them more attractive or more economic to the market, as well as our power grid studies, which are meant to sort of identify the needs ahead of time so that we can build a plan, not only with, again, as Sarah said, again, with all of our stakeholders, our utilities, our developers, our load serving entities, to identify where the infrastructure needs to go.
Let me ask my budget question now. All of your programs are going to involve a fair amount of oversight and planning, both planning and oversight. And, we all know that the quality of that depends on how well funded your agencies are, to have the personnel to do this work. How are you guaranteeing that you're actually going to have the capacity to do this, to do the planning, to do the enforcement, to make sure that different entities are staying on target? Absent a carbon pricing or, an emissions pricing kind of revenue source. Right.
Well, I can answer for New York. So NYSERDA is the central procurement agency for the state. However, the costs of the programs are passed on to all the load serving entities. And so it's the obligation of all the load serving entities to participate and contribute to the clean energy standard. And so I think from that standpoint, it's sort of well funded and back through the investor owned utilities. So that's sort of one point. However, I will just say NYSERDA makes a very concerted effort to drive costs down. And again, removing these challenges and barriers to projects reduce costs. Not to get overly technical, but very recently we switched to an index rec price. We used to offer fixed rec prices, but that put the sort of revenue risk of energy and capacity on the generators. And so this sort of gives them a hedge, if you will, against the energy and capacity markets. Certainly not an exact hedge, but we're hoping to see price reductions driven and as a result of that, and as well as a slew of others I could mention, but really just sort of through concerted efforts of trying to drive the cost to do business down, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Erin, anything you want to say about that?
About budget? Yeah, New Mexico is a rural, poor state. I think we see this as an opportunity, as we come up with these new programs and our legislatures work on them, we often, request, FTEs and funding to go along with them. And they've been great in supporting us as, I mentioned a couple initiatives at the end of my presentation, and we've already, they started pre-filing for 2021 and we're super excited. And, but usually we have to request FTEs and funding to go along with these initiatives.
let me ask a question about the relationship, and this is probably more for Washington and New York, the relationship between the new program and your existing REC program. You know, are there challenges there integrating the two? That's something I've heard people asking questions about. And then also, this is probably directly for you, Sarah. I really appreciate, you know, this strategy of looking at, you know, for the first years of the program, having a REC component and you know, an offset type component. But there are a lot of people, you know, who would like to see us move away from RECs and move away from offsets, you know, because they feel that that is, you know, we want to get the emissions down as quickly as possible. But we know that you know, that final 10% or whatever, 20%, you know, is a real challenge. And so I appreciate the strategy you're using, but how do you, you know, how do you balance that need to get to emissions really reductions, you know, ASAP, and especially with the goal of focusing on frontline impacted communities, but, you know, at the same time, coming up with something that where the costs can be managed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in a really broad way to think about it for me is just, there's a lot of places in CETA where we're thinking about how to better target programs and funding. So I think something around, you know, looking at vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities, creating tools that look at where the highest impacts from those, you know, from climate change and fossil fuels actually are, trying to fold in ideas of, you know, resilience, which pays out, you know, which has a much higher cost benefit over the long term, you know, in terms of project investments. So really trying to think about how those non-energy benefits, providing value for those non-energy benefits. I think that's a huge area where we actually see the true cost and benefit of grid modernization and a move towards renewable energy that isn't always captured in just sort of our normal ways of quantifying those costs. I'd also say that in terms of the alternative compliance mechanisms, one that I didn't mention or skimmed over very briefly was an energy transformation project. So if states are interested in considering not just using a RECs, you know, although that's important and that's useful because it's a system that exists, we also allow for energy transformation projects. So ones that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and would be additive to something that's like a energy efficiency or renewable energy program. So you could imagine like charging infrastructure or some kind of a clean transportation program. So allowing projects to count that reduce emissions and that would count of offsets, you know, and that would also target other sectors. I could see something maybe like some sort of industrial DR project, right? Like something that is getting us towards those climate emission goals. And so the point there is really tying in your clean energy standard with the reality of your emissions needs and, you know, emissions reductions needs in the state. But that's one mechanism that I thought was quite creative and really groundbreaking. And there are new rules that Ecology has written for that, but it is also pretty broad. So there could be there is a lot of opportunity for utilities to be very creative in our state. And I think that's also very important, right? So, you know, providing a space to find the right sort of business case for a creative emissions reductions project within the framework really helps get to that idea of cost, right? We're not being too prescriptive that everyone needs X amount of, you know, battery storage, because actually in our state, standalone storage might not actually be the most cost-effective thing to do. It's going to be important in somewhere, but it is not actually necessarily the thing that gets chosen in a modeling scenario. So, you know, allowing our state to actually move towards things that are actually going to be useful and cost-effective ultimately.
Yeah. So we're really pretty much out of time, but I did want to ask Corinne, one question came in around cost controls for the New York program. You know, the Washington program has a cap on costs, and you know, in order to, you know, keep the burden manageable for ratepayers. Does New York State have something like that as part of their program?
So I can't profess to know every line item of the CLCPA. I do know that our programs are regulated by the commission, and so that the monitoring of the cost of these programs occurs over time. And so as we move forward with these programs, it would certainly be under the purview of the commission. But I'm sorry, I don't know if there's a particular cap. At least I don't think so on our clean energy standard, but there may be under other programs.
Okay. Well, thank you. So, you know, I see that Heather has popped up again, you know, which tells me this is my time to thank you all. Gosh, you've given us so much to work with. I look forward to really spending some time with your PowerPoints, which will be available to everyone, as well as the additional resources that you've steered us towards. So anyway, just want to thank you very much for giving us your time. And don't be surprised if you get some follow-up questions from some of us. Thank you very much.